The final part of my series on early humanity examines the phenomena of money's invention, the first credit-based societies, and coinage. Currency and cash are primarily intellectual concepts, and the development of both makes up the substance of David Graeber's book on the history of debt. Money has no essence. It's not really anything. Therefore, its nature has always been, and presumably always will be, a matter of political contention. While it may be a matter of contention, that does not invalidate the political consensus achieved across the known world in broad historical eras. It is this to which I will devote the following video. Adam Smith was the first modern economist to theorize the origins of money, and he settled on the idea that it was created in order to facilitate transactions between people who had prior to its invention simply bartered goods directly. This has since, however, been proven entirely false by anthropologists who have observed the gift economy in pre-market societies. Money did not evolve naturally in the wild to simplify exchange, but was conjured up by bureaucracies in order to record debts. The gift economy worked as the primary form of resource allocation in pre-money societies, whereby an individual with an excess of some commodity would simply give this to whoever was in need, with the obligation that the favour would be returned when they fell on hardship at some unspecified date later. Barter, however, did play a part in these societies, but only when they met enemies or foreigners, because in that game there would be winners and losers, and they would never likely encounter each other again. This is not to say that Adam Smith did not get a few things right. He just slipped up on this one particular conclusion because he had no hard evidence and interpreted the world through a certain lens that involved seeing all human behaviour as acting upon self-interest. Today, many see his conclusions as naively optimistic about the benevolent invisible hand ushering resources to where they need to be. But they were a giant leap forward from the mercantilist thought that came before him, that claimed gold and silver were the basis for wealth, and sought to succeed economically by war and plunder. Self-interest was Smith's guiding principle, not greed, and this included nurturing one's own moral character. His ideas in general were driven by common sense, which led some of his inferences to bear the mark of his era's prejudices more than its ostensible commitment to strictly empirical inquiry. Do you remember the Fertile Crescent from the previous video? Well, Mesopotamia has the earliest record of money and financial exchange in the world. Probably because their cities also preserved the first writing, which was initially an accounting tool. Unlike in ancient Greece or Rome, however, there is no evidence that they used any physical currency. Sure, there was payment, and the king demanded tribute, but citizens would pay in goods equivalent to the value of however many monetary units they owed. In effect, all taxes were tax in kind, but they did have a fixed value which bureaucrats employed by the ruler kept a record of. There was a problem with the system, however. What if you couldn't pay what you owed on time? Debtors could be forced to pay interest on missed payments, but more likely, they would be enslaved by their creditor for the duration they deemed adequate. This was a cruel way to live, but it is essentially how we live now, minus the legal slavery. The Mesopotamians had a solution, however. Every few years, the king would cancel all private debt, essentially hitting the reset button and wiping the slate clean. Cancelling debt is something politicians discuss today, but rarely a proposal so radical as to eliminate all private obligations owed between citizens. Nevertheless, despite how appealing this policy sounds, it merely deferred the problem for another few years each time. Traditionally, the market and the state have been construed as being in opposition to one another, whereby the state inhibits the activities of the market, and the market circumvents the limitations of the state. This, however, is a false dichotomy, because historically, states have been instrumental in the creation of markets, to which there was no naturally occurring precedent. Graeber traces the origin of the market to the policies of ancient civilizations who needed a way to pay their infantry. On making a conquest, they would mine the territory's natural silver, stamp it, and distribute it among their soldiers. The troops would then exchange their coins with the locals for food. Once the defeated population accumulated enough silver, the new ruler would demand part of this back in tribute, or taxes, thus funding further conquest and, in theory, perpetuating the cycle. Now, you might be thinking, that seems a bit unfair, perhaps even immoral, and you'd be in good company. It was around this time, known as the Axial Age, which began around 500 BC, that philosophers began to grapple with the question of the ethics of money. This was the start of an era in which coinage took over from credit as the dominant monetary system. The greatest thinkers of the Axial Age hated money because it did not fit into their picture of an ideal human society. Money made people greedy, selfish and grasping, and was a barrier to sharing, selflessness and charity. The merchants from far-off lands that it created were a nuisance to rulers because they introduced novelty into a closed system that, if only isolated, might be perfected. They disrupted social cohesion by introducing an unpredictable variable, and told tales of how kings, beyond a state's territory, did things differently, and thereby fostering a new science of comparative politics. Money didn't make sense because interest had no logic. How could metal, coins, breed and create something from nothing? This seemed to defy the principle of the clear separation of substance and ideal. Money was, in effect, the Word made flesh. Money and its evils led many groups to renounce the corrupt world, and intellectual popular peace movements, also known as religions, swelled in response.